Welcome back. The next slide that we're going to look at together is an overview of different areas of treatment strategies that we can consider in relation to culture and treating trauma. Fortunately, in the last 20 years, we've seen tremendous development in treatment approaches to trauma, and much more recently, revived and I think more committed interest in the impact of culture. And while we can't begin to teach all the strategies available, and would certainly encourage you to seek training in methods that particularly include attention to embodied experiences for the clients. Our hope today is that between the slides and the commentary, we can at least point you towards some useful methodologies. And then I think the challenge for all of us is to use our creativity to develop adaptations of these methods that fit the cultural frame of reference that the clients bring to us. And hopefully in some of the videos of Sydney's actual experiences, you'll get an embodied sense of what we're talking about. So once again, we're going to turn our attention to helping clients manage hyper and hypoarousal because of the huge role it plays in keeping the clients trapped in the grip of trauma. And also then we're going to look at some additional strategies in the next couple of slides. And finally, looking at treatment strategies wouldn't be complete without considering the inclusion of significant people in the person's life, potentially during each phase of the treatment, based on the individual assessment of the client's circumstances. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about mindfulness, breath work, yoga, and some of the reasoning for why we would include some of these techniques. And again, it's an adaptation. It's not the same as teaching a class. I think clinicians would need to have their own familiarity through taking classes, but then based on where the client is, seeing what you can do to, and I'm going to make some suggestions along the way, but what you can do to break these approaches down into steps. And one of the reasons we're starting with these three and the video on synergy dance that you saw is that mindfulness, breathwork, yoga, dance are activities that many cultures accept and expose their populations to. So in addition to synergy dance, which you've seen, and for example, in the explanation about synergy dance, if you look at the different elements and just perhaps a simple movement that you could do with the client in the chair, you don't have to necessarily ask them to stand up. You don't ask. I think you'd want to be very careful about, in a sense, asking them to perform in front of you, but rather you would do everything along with them. And again, just something seated in the chair, certainly to begin with. The reason these kinds of techniques are useful is because they bring the body into the client's awareness. And the goal isn't to create the perfect form of any of these techniques, but rather to help, through the use of them, to help the clients begin to connect their body sensation, the sensations that they feel in their bodies, the emotions that might get stirred up, to what their body, how their body is positioned in space, in what positions are more comfortable, what positions facilitate a more even breath. And so all of that taken together helps the clients to begin to trust their own internal perceptions and how those perceptions relate to the world around them. They're useful in helping clients to remain in the present, to draw them back into the here and now, not just with the mind, but again, with the body's participation, which then sends signals helps the brain to send signals to the rest of the body to calm down or to release energy to allow the person to respond. They also lend themselves to more easily being broken down into small steps that clients can make choices to practice what works for them. They're helpful in as the clients are able to remain more centered. It helps to expand what we think about as their window of tolerance, so that as they experience waves of emotion, sensation, they can remain centered rather than becoming dysregulated. Another piece of work in this area involves helping the client to identify what circumstances internally, in their thoughts, in their emotions, in their movements, possibly something in relation to what you're saying, becomes a trigger. And so, again, the idea is not necessarily to help the client to always remain in a calm, centered place, but rather to help them to see and empower them as a result that when they begin to sense some dysregulation, there are things that they can do to restore more of a sense of calm, because there's no way that we can prevent our clients. We can't, I mean, I think we can see that with ourselves, the people around us. Life is full of triggers all the time, and in a sense, the daily practice is about moving back and forth between feeling triggered or aroused by something, and then moving oneself back to a calmer place. And that, it reminds me a lot about what's taught in meditation classes. When in mindfulness classes, when you're taught to focus on the breath or the mantra, that the real practice isn't in achieving that steady, calm state, but actually to catch yourself when you're starting to become distracted and aroused, and know how to return yourself to a calmer state. One of the things, though, in using any of these techniques is to remember, because in many classes, there is always an emphasis on being mindful of one's breathing. But for clients who have experienced trauma and trauma connected to trafficking, just the sound of their breath may be triggering internally memories of what their breath sounded like when they were being mistreated. It may trigger memories of the sound of the breath of the person who was mistreating them. So this is something you need to check out with the clients ahead of time, to get a sense of, have you ever listened to your own breath before? What is that like? You may take a moment with them if they don't have any response to those questions, to begin to see what that's like, starting very slowly, indicating that you'll do it together, reminding them that they can stop at any point, going back to using those hand signals. I think some of the grounding practices that guide people to feel connected to the earth, and at the same time feel the connection to the larger life forces, the heavens. Again, the wording would depend on what your client is familiar with. Can be useful in some situations, provided you've checked out where they are spiritually, and if that kind of terminology would appeal to them. The use of simple centering practices. You can have your client still sitting in the chair and just swaying gently back and forth, and then practicing coming to a stopping point that feels balanced. You can also have the client raise and lower their arms in accordance with the movement of their breath. At the same time, asking them to maintain awareness of the central part, the sort of central line in their bodies. Now, again, you may have to practice each of those components separately before putting it all together, because we want to be very careful about overwhelming clients, creating expectations that they can do things that they're not yet prepared to do. Some clients will enjoy drawing pictures of what they experience. Some clients may want to write about their experiences. If their first language is not English, you may want to encourage them to write in their native language, and then if they're going to talk about it with you, then they can summarize it in English. One thing you may notice is that I really have not put, and I'm not going to put today, any particular emphasis on teaching meditation per se, because there are a lot of steps actually to getting to a point where someone can sit and either allow the focus on the breath, allow the focus on a mantra, to create shifts in their consciousness. And again, I think we have to remember that shifts in consciousness may be very uncomfortable for our clients. So what we're looking at today are the basic elements that you would work with in order to prepare a client perhaps to do meditation at some point down the road. Now, the next slide that we're going to look at is about emotional regulation and self-soothing. This is another area that our clients who have experienced trauma may have significant deficits in being able to provide for themselves, not because, in a sense, they're incapable, but more that they haven't had consistent opportunities to learn about themselves in this way. So the slide gives us a summary of different inroads to self-regulation and self-soothing. And what I want to say in general about these are that in many approaches, advocate the use of safe space imagery. And imagery is, I think, a very important tool to gaining access to felt sense, body sensation. At the same time, I think we have to pay particular attention to the wording of that imagery. And the place that I'd like to make a few comments about to start has to do with creation of what we call safe space. So one of the things is I would be very careful in using the word safe with clients, because just hearing that word may be a trigger. For some people, they may have been told, oh, you're going to be taken to a safe place, or, oh, you're safe with me. And then the degree of betrayal that they experienced in relation to safe places and being safe with people is excruciating. So I like to try to find another word that perhaps the client chooses. Maybe it's quieter, maybe it's calmer, maybe it's just spaciousness itself, or an empty space, or they can fill the space with what to them would feel soothing. And sometimes, again, the words have to be illustrated to the client. So giving them an option to feel a smooth surface or a furry surface, or comparing a rough surface to a smoother surface. As you're starting to talk about this, so that you can get a sense of, well, what does feel soothing to the client. In my own practice, I don't use template scripts because, again, the languaging may not be something that appeals to the client, but rather in talking with the client, and I explain this while I'm doing it, but sometimes I'm jotting down words that they use, experiences that they talk about. And so then when it's time to use imagery, I go back and ask them to elaborate on some of those experiences that they may have just mentioned in the course of the session. As I was saying, because of the challenges that clients may experience in linking felt sense to their awareness, or being able to label it or connect it to what is pleasing and not pleasing in terms of body sensation. You may spend time with clients just rubbing their palms together, talking about what that feels like, feeling how their shoes feel on their feet, seeing if they'd like to remove their shoes and compare having shoes on and shoes off. Because I think in asking clients to go back to body sensation, we may be treading on very sensitive territory. So it's important to go very slowly, and so that you can pause and wait for the client to be able to come up with words. Doesn't mean sometimes you wouldn't suggest things like tingling or heaviness, but you might then be asking the client to translate that for you in a way, not necessarily in a language you don't understand, but in the way they use English to talk to you. A very simple sequence to teach clients. Again, simple, yes, it only involves a couple steps, but just always keep remembering that each simple step may be huge for the client in the room with you. But one of them is to begin by having the client just rub each of their arms and maybe breathe a little more slowly. And then move to giving themselves a hug. And then move to sitting for a moment with their hands on their heart. Just those 3 steps, and spending time exploring what comes up for the client. You might only work on one of those steps in one session or 3 sessions, I can't begin to say enough about taking your time. Some of Peter Levine's techniques, using voice, and again, incorporating voice for clients can be a tremendous request, because their experiences in using their voice, as we know, may have been met with pretty terrible consequences. But Peter Levine talks about using the VU sound on the exhale, with one hand on the abdomen, so that you, one or both hands, to feel the vibration in the belly. The point of all of these kinds of exercises is to help the clients begin to differentiate when is sensation coming from inside their bodies, and to expand the window of tolerance for that, and what is the relationship between what they feel inside and what's going on outside. Because if you can think about times when you were in a situation that you felt like things were coming at you very suddenly, and a lot of different things much more quickly than you could keep up with, it's very tempting in those situations to think that it's all happening outside of you, and to misrepresent that, yes, there is something going on outside, but there is a parallel process going on inside. And that often can get lost. And that leads people to be very confused in their perceptions and their understandings of reality. So then another component that we want to take a look at is the integration of traumatic memories. And to start with, I think one of the things that both the literature and certainly my own experience supports is that the healing that takes place for the client is less about the client revealing all the details of what they experienced, but rather in providing opportunities to take small pieces of experience and processing them in a way that the brain, because of its neuroplasticity, can rewire itself and its connection to the vagus nerve. And it's in that rewiring and the learning to name emotions and to not be frightened by the sensation. Those are all key elements in reestablishing trust in oneself inside. And this rewiring is done when the therapist helps the client to take a moment that is highly arousing and may result in hyperarousal, or could result in more of a freeze response or a collapse response, and helping the client to move back and forth. And between those two states. And you may well have heard words like titration of the experience, and pendulation, the movement back and forth. And we see that in verbal techniques, we see that in EMDR. And what's significant about these techniques is that it's not just about what goes on in the room, but clients are also learning then to take the experiences that go on in the room with you out into the world, because there is, as I said before, there's no way to avoid being triggered if we're going to live in the world. And this pendulation back and forth is consistent with what we might eventually also practice in teaching meditation to clients. So it is certainly during these moments in treatment when, as clients are recalling pieces of memory, felt senses of experiences, that there is the possibility for very strong emotion coming forth. And the idea, again, is not to immediately step in and try to reduce for the therapist to be trying to immediately reduce the level of arousal, but rather to engage the client so they know that you are there with them, and then help them to move through some of the practices that you've been working on to get to a calmer place. And you may, again, want to use the hand signals. You may want to help them attach numbers to the level of arousal. I think these are the times when the experience of grief, the experiences of guilt, of shame, of anger are going to come through. And when I talk about this, I never stop having a flash of memory of an experience with a client. I don't know, it's probably been about 15 years now, but this person had come to me after his son had shot himself. His son was 12 years old, had shot himself during the course of the school day at home using his father's gun. And the dad's culture was Vietnamese. He was sitting with me and accusing himself over and over and over again. And I think in looking back, I feel that I moved too quickly. And he said to me, please don't take away my right to accuse myself. It's what is making me feel human at this time. And I really heard those words, and they've always been with me when clients have begun to express strong emotion and have helped me to slow down and not try to help them see immediately that there are other ways of looking at things. Um, the ability, I think, to be with our clients, and for us to model bearing some of the strong emotion that they're experiencing and just reflecting that back uh, can be very calming to people. So what that means, of course, is that we have to pay attention to what's going on inside of us as we're listening. And noticing our own sensations, the disturbing sensations, and doing what we need to do alongside what we're talking to clients about. And we're going to be talking more in the last section about self-care strategies. I think in our efforts to provide psychoeducation, this is a time for reflection again on what some of the cultural implications are, because we may have been taught, for example, to attempt to normalize some of the emotions, some of the sensations associated with trauma. And at the same time, the question of what is considered normal emotion or normal sensation in a particular culture, and how that individual person has interpreted those messages. I think it's important to explore that with the client before we attempt any kind of psychoeducation about it. I think this is also a time when that's useful for discussing flashbacks in the context of being opportunities to bring healing to parts of themselves that are still crying out for it. And some of the methodologies like IFS, internal family systems, can be extremely useful in this area. There are often questions asked about the use of medication. And so, again, we want to start at the ground level and make sure that we have an understanding of what is considered medicinal in the client's experience, and what their feelings are about receiving a medication. I think we know that there is no medication for trauma as a whole. Sometimes certain medications can be used to help with some of the symptoms or signals of trauma, helping to address some of the intensity so that the client is able to learn new skills. But I think it's very important to make clear to the client that if they are going to go for a consultation about medication, that they understand that it is a consultation. In other words, it's an opportunity to gain information about what might be helpful. And then it's up to them to choose whether or not they want to use this medication. And they can choose at the time that they see the person prescribing, who can prescribe medication. They can think about it for several weeks. You can help them find material that they can look at about it. They can talk about it with you. But a lot of times people think as soon as you talk about a medication consultation that, okay, now I'm going to have to take medicine. It's like you're imposing it on them. And I think it's just very important to make clear that that's not the case. Also, with people who have been trafficked, they've also many times been drugged as well. So they may have many feelings about being asked by someone else, here, swallow something. So it may take time to build some trust in before you can actually move toward having a consultation. The third piece in trauma treatment involving restoring connections to life is a huge one for clients. And what this slide does is identify some of the markers for tracking where the client is in terms of being ready to integrate back into their daily lives. And I think we have to keep in mind that when we talk about integrating back into daily life, it may be a different life than the one that they left before they were trafficked, and the life that they were immersed in while they were being trafficked. Because, as we talked about earlier, sometimes their communities won't even accept them back. We also know, as we talked about, that in some situations, in many countries, the person who is trafficked ends up being accused of being part of the crime. And so when the client first comes to you, you and the people you connect them with may be the first steps in establishing a new sense of community. And I think that's, if there are opportunities for clients to participate in groups with other people, to participate in group activities, all of these provide more secure ways initially for the client to be trying out some very early stages of trusting that they indeed belong. I think also important to helping clients make a reconnection is to spend time anticipating and exploring with the client what their concept of what's acceptable, what's acceptable in other people, what's acceptable in how they respond to people and what they're going to do in the instances where people may not respond in the way that they hope. So that's again another time for going back and practicing some of the self-regulating behaviors and skills that you and the client have been working on. It also requires knowledge of resources and a plan for how the client is going to obtain ongoing support in the community through survivor groups, employment assistance, educational support, perhaps training in additional language skills, housing, so that some of the things that had to be put in place early on for the client to have a sense of safety have to be reworked now before the client is going to go on to take some of the next steps. And as I mentioned, you may also want to spend some time not only going over how the client's going to respond in unanticipated circumstances with other people, but also how they're going to take care of themselves if they are to experience a flashback, if they are to experience the lethargy that can come with a shutting down or the upsurge of fear. I think it's important for clients to understand that some of these things are going to continue to occur. It is part of being alive and human. And in practicing over and over and over, and hopefully you've been able to do that over and over again in the sessions, eventually some of these skills will start to come more naturally. So the last piece that I'd like to talk about in terms of treatment strategies has to do with family, involving families and other anchoring relationships. And this slide includes some principles about engaging family members, significant others, and helping support the client. And it may be at each stage of the intervention. And I think at each stage, just a decision needs to be made about whether to include and how much to include, and whether to include everyone together or meet with individuals from the family or significant friends. And of course, all of this has to be done with the client's permission and participation. And these decisions are about clinical judgment, depending on what information you have, what your sense of the client's readiness is, where they are in their own process of self-forgiveness, what you've heard about the significant other's ability to be supportive of the client when they're in distress. Now, it's not that significant others have to qualify as perfectly suited, as much as having some sense of whether they would be open to learning alongside the client. So, and some of the work with family members and friends may be very similar to the titration and pendulation that you're using in working with the clients. Some of the individuals involved may have been trafficked themselves at some point and never had any intervention. Um, some of them may be feeling very guilty, very ashamed, feeling very powerless that they weren't able to help. Um, so, so in many ways, it's another process of assessment and planning interventions that are focused on the family system, the friendships. And finally, the last thing I think to keep in mind is that a significant number of people aren't going to be going back to their families. And so what you're looking to do along the way in the treatment process is maybe to help the person identify one new individual that they want to establish a more anchoring relationship with. And you might consider having some joint sessions with that person. And also, again, looking for ways to help survivors connect with resources and activities in the community. And certainly during this phase, being available to the client or having someone be available if they're going to a new place to help them process the experiences that they're having. So once again, before we move on to the final area of this presentation, which is self-care, I'm going to pause for a moment and like you to take a pause as well to look back over the slides, to see what piques your curiosity, to see where you might have questions. And then we'll resume again in just a few minutes to talk about self-care. So as we begin this final section about self-care, I'd invite you to take a moment, maybe to raise and lower your shoulders, move around a little bit, get comfortable, take a couple of slow and easy breaths. Like when we work with clients, we just start by taking a moment to pay attention to our breath. And we don't ask clients to change the way they're breathing. It's rather through the process of paying attention to the rhythm of breathing that the breathing itself begins to change. The body knows how to breathe. It breathes itself. So just taking a few moments to pause with your own easy breath, inhaling and exhaling. I just invite you to listen to me read what I came across as labeled as the therapist serenity prayer. I came across this years ago when I was regularly giving presentations about self-care to a group of younger social workers that I was supervising and in charge of a program for training them. So it begins. Grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot control or change, the courage to listen and remain open without judgment, the curiosity to ask questions that inspire growth, and the creativity to use my skills in ways that meet my clients' needs where they are, and the wisdom to know my boundaries and when to seek consultation. So with that, not only prayer, but in a way, it's a statement of intention. This next part of the presentation is looking at how we can maintain ourselves in a place of presence where we can honor the intentions of what this prayer suggests. So the first slide that we're going to look at is one that reviews some of the different terms that you're going to come across when you are encountering, when you're thinking about self-care. So what you may notice or begin to think about is that the first two terms on this slide, stress and vicarious trauma, aren't unusual for us to experience in the course of doing our jobs. You work in an agency, there is stress sometimes in connection to what the agency expectations are, in the context of the level of client need that you encounter. Certainly sitting and listening to individuals speak of harrowing experiences and remain present and compassionate and connected, that takes a tremendous amount of energy. It takes an empathy involving connecting oneself to the experience and yet retaining an awareness of one's own boundaries. So it's not unusual in any way to begin to feel stressed, feel some rumblings of trauma sensations in your body. And sometimes that can be useful also in noticing out loud with the clients in a mirroring kind of way what you're experiencing. And yet at the same time, it's very important that we notice what's happening in ourselves, whether the stress, whether the vicarious trauma experiences are building up in us as we move from session to session to session. Because if we don't attend to them, then we're more at risk to moving on to the third and the fourth experiences in relation to doing our work. And what can happen is that our defense system will step in almost automatically to try to protect us. But that can take the form of not listening so well anymore, and therefore missing certain important cues from the client, important pieces of information, shutting down inside, which can then transmit to the client in nonverbal kinds of ways that they and you may not be aware of what's happening, but yet it's influencing the energy that exists between the two of you to work on the healing process. Sometimes what happens is clinicians are aware that that they're struggling to maintain the presence that they intend to, and then they try working even harder. And that working harder just begins to create a vicious cycle of guilt and shame, feelings of inadequacy, and it becomes a self-perpetuating difficulty. So I want to begin by just encouraging you to both notice and form a space of compassion for yourself when you are experiencing the stress and some of the vicarious body sensations and emotions and thoughts. As we started to talk about a few minutes ago, in relation to agency expectations, our own expectations, if we're going to begin to take care of ourselves, we have to look at, well, what are the risk factors that we need to address in our self-care practices. And I think one of the ones that really stands out to me in working with complex trauma, and certainly I think in what you would find working with trafficking survivors, is how easily you're at risk for all of these factors, but particularly your own set of unrealistic goals and expectations about how much you can do and the time frame in which you can do it. And so there are time constraints, there are limitations in resources, there are limitations in your own internal resources. We are not made to go 24/7 without time for our nervous system to re-regulate itself. And again, I would encourage you to gain some understanding of the theoretical material about the role of the vagus nervous system, because I think in taking some time to apply that to yourself, you will have a much better understanding and more insight into what might be going on with the clients. When you sense the urgency, the level of the client's distress and the intensity of that distress. And there's also just a tremendous amount of uncertainty in guiding a therapeutic process, both in the room, and it's not like life comes to a halt for the client when they're in treatment with you. They are continuing to have experiences that are going to be brought in the room, and you're not going to know ahead of time what those are going to be. So I think one of the things we're always preparing ourselves for when we walk into a session is that we are going to be presented with uncertainties, and we want to maintain our own connection to inner wisdom to help guide us through those moments. And again, having your own nervous system calm down is really the doorway that you need to access that kind of wisdom. One particular experience that I think is worth paying attention to in yourself is when you feel a reluctance or when you have mixed feelings about obtaining consultation. People feel embarrassed. They think they should know more. Often they think they should know more than it's possible for anyone to know. People feel guilty that they're not doing a better job. They feel ashamed at with the thought of exposing themselves to another person hearing about their experiences. And I think one of the things that goes into that is that we, in our efforts to live up to our ideal therapist self, we project that onto other people and assume that, well, they're always living up to their ideal therapist selves. And I think most people who offer consultation or supervision are aware of this discrepancy, the discrepancy between being the one providing the consultation and being the one in the room with the client. I think also when we notice that reluctance, that embarrassment, shame, it also can be seen as a signal to our wiser self that we are in need of compassion, as opposed to belittlement or criticism for what we may have done or may not have done. And it's in the developing of this kind of compassion within ourselves, for ourselves, that we start to form the foundation for supporting ourselves through the long term in our careers. It's very easy to come into a situation, whether it's a new job or it's a new client, with a lot of energy, feeling really gung ho. But then usually we are reminded, as with any relationship, that relationships and healing take time. And if we're going to remain, uh, if we're going to maintain vitality throughout the course of our career life cycle, um, it does require a constant supply of our own compassion. And when that's wavering, again, using consultation to help reopen that doorway. So this next slide reveals some of the warning signs for that, those third and fourth terms that we looked at on the initial slide regarding compassion fatigue and burnout. And many of these may look like symptoms or signs of what we see associated with anxiety and depression. But I think some of them particularly apply when we're looking at escalations of stress and vicarious trauma in our working environments. One of them is a loss of hope, faith, and effectiveness in oneself and the tools we have at hand. Sometimes people notice that they are becoming increasingly cynical about themselves, about the clients. Another is when you find yourself feeling more beleaguered by thoughts about your clients, particularly if you're waking up at night, and certainly being able to get a good night's sleep is essential to restoring ourselves from day to day. Sometimes you might find that you're starting to have intrusive images in relation to what you've listened to, and sense your own flashbacks. That may be experiences you've had, or they may be what your mind has conjured up in images as the client talks. Another sign that you want to pay particular attention to is if you notice an increase in the ways that you might seek a quick fix to lower your stress level. For some people, that might be the use of substances. For some people, that could be shopping, watching a lot of TV. It's not that any one of these things is necessarily engaging in one of these things is necessarily a more harmful behavior, but it's when you notice that you're deviating from your usual patterns. And as I was thinking back about burnout and compassion fatigue, I don't, and I may be wrong in this, I may not have read carefully enough, but I don't recall that being really specifically cited in the DSM. And while we could think about it as applying to us in the clinical community, there are certainly many different helping professions, service professions, jobs of all kinds that lead to burnout. And I think certainly when we are doing assessments of clients in general, um, we may want to keep in mind that burnout may be a contributing factor to what our clients are presenting. So let's take a few minutes to look at um, what some of the restorative strategies can be, both in a more general way and a more specific way. And when I'm saying that, I'm talking about in a general way, and that's what you're seeing on the screen right now. These are strategies that are more broad-based and that you can adapt. You can pick different ones to fit some of your interests, some of your aptitudes. But I don't think we give enough attention to self-care strategies during art sessions, in between art sessions. I don't think it's just about waiting until the end of the workday or waiting until the weekend, because I think what many people find is that they feel so depleted by the end of the day or by the end of the week that then they don't have the energy to engage in the strategies that might be restorative. And so, again, we may find ourselves getting into a pattern or a kind of vicious cycle of knowing what we should be doing, but not feeling like we can take the time or the energy to do it. So I'm going to put the next slide up in a minute, and on that slide is a listing of things that you can do during sessions, in between sessions, and I drew a lot of this material from work that Babette Rothschild has done on compassion fatigue and some of the strategies that she presents in her books, her manuals, her training. A lot of these tools may be self-explanatory, and I think you will find in your packets what I think of as kind of a self-care menu. And you can use that to jot down some ideas you have for each category that you feel work for you. So you'll notice in these in-session self-care strategies that it's really directed toward the what I would call the second 50% of the work we're doing in the room, and that is monitoring our own reactions and paying attention to how we're reacting to the client's words, the nonverbal communication. What are the kinds of sensory images we're creating as we listen? And do we need to create some reconnection to ourselves, to our own physical boundary? Do we need to take just a little bit of a step back to put the images that we're seeing on a screen inside, rather than absorbing them full-heartedly? I think in our emphasis sometimes on maintaining empathy and communicating that empathy. It's as though we are unconsciously giving permission for all the valves, all the pores in our system to just take in and absorb. And what we often don't realize is that our systems can open quite a great deal, and we can absorb so much that it becomes overwhelming. And sometimes you may notice that during a session suddenly you're at a loss for words, or you feel your own heart rate starting to accelerate. Those are all signals not to work harder, not to think faster, but to take a moment during the course of the session to slow down, to feel your own body outline, to focus on your own breath, tense and release some of your muscles so that you are able to feel more of a connection to your own center of grounding rather than be moving along inside with how the clients may be wavering. So I hope that you will take some time to practice some of these techniques and look further into them so that they become almost second nature over time. Again, this very much parallels what we are trying to assist our clients in establishing for themselves. So now we have reached the end of the formal presentation, and we'd like to thank you for investing your time in watching, investing your energies in considering what we've presented. We hope that it's provided you with some new directions in pursuing practice from a multicultural perspective. We hope it's offered an introduction to trafficking and certainly a foundation in self-care. And I would encourage you, and I believe that this has been added to the bibliography we already had, Sydney's memoir called How a Cup of Tea Changed My Life. How a Cup of Masala Tea Changed My Life. Is now available on Amazon. And this book is a memoir. It's not a clinical guide. But I think if you are trying to cultivate in yourself what it means to have a different sensation of cultural awareness, not so much this book is not an introduction to a broad range of cultures, but an introduction to the culture that Sydney experiences. And what's marvelous about it is it can be through reading it, you can get a felt sense of what it's like to be immersed in another culture. And I just found that I came away after reading it with the sense of what I needed to begin to feel in myself that would let me know that I had some understanding of a culture that was different than mine. So again, I'm kind of emphasizing, yes, there's a lot you can read about different cultures, but at the same time, the idea of reading things that might give you a felt sense. And I think I've come to see that memoirs and sometimes fiction are a good way into that. In bringing this workshop experience to a close, I'd again like you or invite you to pause in gratitude with me for a moment to Sydney for being willing to share her experiences, to being committed to bringing this workshop and encouraging all of us who have participated in continuing to work on it and to find a way to bring it out there. And that gratitude also includes the people that Sydney has worked with here in the United States and in Nepal, and to the clients who are forever continuing to inspire and teach us, and also gratitude to each of our own efforts to work collaboratively with one another and learn from each other so that we can continue to provide a level of excellence to the services we provide. And may we each recognize the significance of our own unique contributions and remain inspired to carry on that mission of empowerment and healing forward each day and throughout the course of our careers. And so it is now and for generations to come. Thank you again.